In chapter 5, we're going to be looking at aggression and violence. Aggression is interesting because it's very subjective. Not all aggression is violent or even illegal, which makes the definition of aggression interesting and difficult. And it's subjective in that what I might view as being verbally or physically aggressive, the next person might not view that as being verbally or physically aggressive. So it's an interesting topic. Technically, the social definition, according to our textbook, is the intent and attempt to harm another individual physically, socially, or in some cases to destroy an object. And that includes passive aggressive behaviors and very aggressive behaviors, and it can include verbal aggression or physical aggression. In our country, it's interesting because there are definitely aggressive behaviors, even physically aggressive behaviors that are socially acceptable. Think of sports, football and hockey. That type of aggression is socially acceptable. The aggression that our police officers or our military are allowed to engage in. If we are defending ourselves, the aggression is justified. So it's interesting. If you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, animals need aggression to survive. And certainly some people would suggest, like evolutionary psychologists, that the reason that men tend to be more aggressive than women, just kind of biologically, is that at one point in our evolutionary history, men needed to be aggressive to protect themselves and their significant others and their offspring. So it's an interesting topic. And the question often becomes not only what is aggressive, but where does aggression come from? Is it biological? Is it learned? Or is it both? But it's definitely complex. Buss in 1971 attempted to classify aggression along two dimensions. The first is active aggression and the second is passive aggression. And so you can see under active, we have direct, would be like punching, would be physical or hitting. Verbal would be insulting somebody. So those are direct acts of aggression. Indirect might be a practical joke, a booby trap, malicious gossip. And then passive, obstructing somebody's passageway, refusing to speak to them, refusing to perform necessary task, refusing consent. It's interesting, and there are definitely different types of aggression. Feshbach in 1964 recognized that there were two types of aggression, hostile and instrumental. So he based this on the goals or rewards that somebody is seeking to achieve with their aggression. So hostile occurs in response to something. Anger-inducing conditions like, and that can be real or imagined, physical attacks or even one's own failure. The aggressor's goal is to make the victim suffer. This is the type that we're most concerned about because it has the most violence associated with it. When you think of crimes like homicide, rape, and assault, they usually involve hostile aggression, where the goal is to make the victim suffer. Instrumental aggression begins in response to competition or the desire for something. That could be another person, money, a TV, etc. Instrumental aggression is involved with crimes like robbery. And there's usually not a lot of physical aggression, but there can be. But there's definitely a means to an end with the aggression. Aggression, defined by the textbook, is behavior perpetrated or attempted with the intention of harming one or more individuals physically or psychologically or to destroy an object. You can see that's slightly different than the social definition of aggression. Now, when it comes to violence, violence is destructive physical aggression intentionally directed at harming another person or things. So violence always includes aggression. Aggression is not always violent. Remember, think of aggression on the hockey field or a football field. It's not always considered to be violent, but violence always includes aggression. I know that that's kind of a weird concept. So for our purposes, we'll use these definitions, looking at the intention of the behavior. Based on these definitions, you can see that that violence, again, it always includes aggression, and it's an integral part of violence to be aggressive. But not all aggressive behavior would be defined or viewed as violent in our culture. Now, theoretical perspectives on aggression are really trying to explain perhaps where aggression comes from. The psychodynamic model is based on the works of Sigmund Freud. For those of you who aren't psych majors, you might not be terribly familiar with his work. But Freud believed that all humans, kind of by their very nature, are at least prone to aggression. The psychodynamic or hydraulic model, and it's typically called the psychodynamic model when we're talking about Freud's work, says that aggression can start from birth and build up over time. Freud believed that if people hold things in, they don't speak their truth, that aggression kind of builds up over a long period of time and can kind of explode. He believed also that that we have an unconscious level, and he believed that a lot of our aggressive thoughts and desires and actions towards people are at the unconscious level, and they often come out in things like dreams. Freud also believed, like ethologist, that human aggression was, again, biological, again, suggesting that all humans are kind of prone to aggressive behavior. Ethology is the study of animal behavior, and I mentioned earlier that animals do need aggression to survive, to maintain their territory, to fight for mates, to protect their offspring, to fight for food and resources in their environment. Konrad Lorenz wrote a book called a book on aggression in 1966. He was an ethologist that studied animal behavior. You might actually be familiar with some of Konrad Lorenz's work. He did work on imprinting, which is kind of like attachment, with geese, and he had geese hatch with a mom and geese that he hatched, and he found that the baby geese imprinted on him and followed him around, and he actually had to teach them how to fly. There was a movie, that's why I think you might be familiar with it, where he actually had a bicycle with wings attached to it, and the little geese would follow him, and he would teach them how to fly that way. But he did suggest that animals have to have aggression to survive, and it's based on an evolutionary, innately programmed concept, according to Lorenz and other ethologists. Again, to protect their territory, their offspring. Some animals do have what he called ritualized aggression, displays of force displayed throughout the animal kingdom, teeth, claws, postures, colors, things like that. The ethology perspective has evolved into what we would now call today is evolutionary psychology, and argues aggression is biological and normal, especially in men, as I mentioned earlier. There's a really interesting book on human behavior compared to animal behavior called The Naked Ape by Desmond Morris. And, we don't often compare human behavior to animal behavior, but he did a really interesting job with this book of comparing a lot of our behaviors with animal behaviors. The frustration aggression hypothesis. Around the time of Freud's death in 1939, a group of Yale psychologists proposed that aggression was the consequence of frustration, not biology as suggested by Freud and the ethologist. And we talked about frustration in a previous chapter. This frustration aggression hypothesis was often criticized for being too simple and because frustration is difficult to define. Remember, we are frustrated when we're blocked from obtaining something, especially if we were able to obtain that something previously, and now our attempts are being blocked. Berkowitz in the 1960s and 1970s led the charge to revise the theory on aggression. As we saw in chapter 4, this theory suggests that people feel frustration when their goal-directed behavior that worked in the past no longer works for them, and this increases anger. And remember, frustration causes kind of a physical reaction in us. We're physically aroused. Our sympathetic nervous system kind of kicks in. And that anger that is produced by frustration increases the likelihood of aggression. So the revised theory suggests 3 steps. Number 1, the person is blocked from obtaining an expected goal. 2, frustration results generating anger. And 3, anger predisposes or readies the person to behave aggressively. So there's kind of a series of steps that lead up to kind of that anger that puts somebody at the position or the place where they are more likely to be aggressive, particularly physically aggressive. Berkowitz also did some really interesting research on something called the weapons effect. Berkowitz found that in the presence of aggressive stimuli in the environment, it increases the probability of aggressive response. The study that was done in 1967, he got people angry, subjects in the study, and it was male subjects were more likely to engage in aggressive behavior, by the way, with his study. But what he did is he made them kind of angry, and then he put them in a room with either a toy gun or a badminton racket. And he found that people that were in the room with the gun tended to be more physically aggressive and to have more aggressive responses to their anger. So what makes this interesting is that if you think about parts of our country that have more violence, higher crime rates, higher homicide rates, they tend to be parts of the country that also have a lot of weapons. The South, for example, and most of us live here in the South. The South is technically the most dangerous region of the country to live in. We have the highest violent crime rates and the highest homicide rates. We also have the highest number of weapons because people like to hunt. That's kind of part of Southern culture. So, some of the argument has been that when people, again, are frustrated or angry and they happen to have weapons in their house, they're more likely to react in a more violent manner because they have weapons present while they are angry. While his research was really interesting, there hasn't been a lot of subsequent research that has supported that. But it's interesting if you think about, again, like maybe crime rates in the South, or really even look at the United States as a whole. We have a lot of guns. We have a lot of weapons in this country. And if you compare our violent crime rates to a country like England or Canada, where they don't have a lot of weapons because guns are not legal, it could be maybe an explanation for why we have higher crime rates here in the United States. It's certainly interesting to think about. The cognitive neo-association model really is just looking at how aversive stimuli in our environment can produce a negative response. A lot of people, when they're in physical pain or even psychological pain, become more physically aggressive. And actually, this is something that you do see in the animal kingdom. So this is something that definitely compares some people, not all people react this way, but some people, when they are in physical or psychological pain, their fuse is very short. And they're more likely to be aggressive, particularly verbally aggressive. But it does happen that when we are not feeling well, we do tend to be a little bit more aggressive. Our fuse is a little bit shorter, and we react a little bit more aggressively. Excitation transfer theory. This is very close to Freud's defense mechanism called displacement. It suggests that physiological arousal, however it's produced, causes us to become angry, frustrated, or aggressive, and we transfer that to others later on when it's more appropriate. In other words, you might be angry at your boss, and it might cause a physiological arousal in you, and it's not appropriate for you to be aggressive towards your boss or yell at your boss. So, that response kind of dissipates because it's not socially appropriate. And then later on, when you get home and you have your kids there, or your pet, or even your spouse, that kind of physiological response is reinvigorated, and you become aggressive towards them. So you kind of transfer your aggression from a target that it's inappropriate to have aggression towards, to somebody that it is kind of an easy target. It's like, going home and kicking the dog kind of concept, looking for an easier target. Displaced aggression theory, very similar. Aggression is placed onto a more acceptable, often innocent target. And again, this is kind of a Freudian concept. The target's innocent, but just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when you're angry. Rumination is, I don't know if you know what rumination is, but rumination is people that kind of get something stuck in their head, and they can't get it out of their head. So, somebody makes them angry, and they think about it, 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 and they become more angry, and they become more aroused about it. It's just really focusing and dwelling on something. And then, lo and behold, somebody innocent walks, into your environment, and you explode onto them. So that's displaced aggression theory and excitation transfer theory are really both about how our aggression towards people is often misdirected. And we all do it all the time. Modeling. Remember, I talked about Albert Bandura and social learning theory. I posted a link, or I posted the video for Bandura's Bobo doll experiment last week. And that's an example of learned aggression. And that particular study was actually on aggression. I mean, there's a lot of different facets for social learning theory, but that particular study was one of the first that looked directly at whether people can learn aggressive behaviors. In that case, it was physical aggression, and his research suggested that, yes, they absolutely can. In that case, it was children. Hostile attribution bias. All right, hostile attribution bias it's a psychological principle that suggests some people, and young people and adults, who tend to be prone towards violence, also have a tendency to interpret ambiguous stimuli as being hostile or threatening. And it probably develops in people for a variety of reasons: peer rejection early on, abuse, maltreatment, violence in the home, witnessing violence in the home. But they tend to view the world through kind of red-tinted, blood-tinted glasses. And it really is, these people really do tend to interpret things kind of automatically, because we're talking about kind of how your thinking works automatically, as being directed towards them, as being threatening towards them. So if you and I walk down the hall in a crowded hallway and somebody, bumps into our shoulder, most of us understand that that's an accident. We say sorry and we move on. Somebody with this kind of thinking bias, if somebody did that to them, they would automatically think that it was on purpose and that person was being threatening to them or hostile towards them. And so they would have a much more aggressive reaction to that. Even something like maybe we're walking down the hall and we see somebody that is a friend and they don't wave to us. Most of us might think, oh, she didn't see me, or, oh, he must be having a bad day. But these people, again, kind of their automatic thinking would take them to the level of, oh my gosh, what a jerk that person is. That person, obviously is not a good person. I mean, they would jump to a very different conclusion than the rest of us would. Research does suggest that this kind of bias begins in preschool and tends to be a stable attribute during childhood and adulthood. Again, when we talk about cognitive models, we're talking about how people think, and the way people think and react is often automatic. We are kind of on autopilot with a lot of our thinking. So again, people with this type of thinking bias tend to have a history of starting very early, of abuse, peer rejection, and violence in the home. Cognitive scripts. Again, we're talking about thinking models here when we talk about cognition. We all develop what are called scripts that help us deal with situations and our social behavior. Scripts are kind of mental categories, if you will, that we learn. Aggression is a fairly simple way of dealing with complex issues. People who, some people have lower levels of intelligence or use more simple scripts to deal with adversity or conflict. They don't have good problem solving skills, for example. So we learn all of our scripts about problem solving and how to work through issues with other people, through direct experience, through observing others, through our childhood. How did our parents deal with problems that they were having with each other? Well, did they talk it out? Did they fight? Did they get physically violent? So we learn how to deal with adversity or conflict. If you have a script, if you learned that you deal with conflict by becoming aggressive, you'll continue to use that throughout your life. If research also finds that people who are a little bit lower in terms of intelligence or low with their social skills, they automatically kind of jump to this type of problem solving with aggression, as opposed to thinking, well, what can I do to diffuse the situation? How can I talk to this person? So scripts on how to deal with conflict definitely can play a role in how we react to adversity or conflict. And a lot of people have scripts based on childhood experiences that kind of automatically jump to aggression. And again, it's kind of that automatic autopilot thinking that people tend to just go to automatically. All right, the general aggression model called GAM, G-A-M, this was developed by DeWall and Anderson in 2011. It's a theoretical framework on violence and aggression that incorporates biological, personality development, social processes, cognitive processes, and decision-making. They suggest that violence and aggression depends on how a person perceives and interprets information, which is highly subjective. And remember, they might have those cognitive bias that we just talked about. So how a person is in terms of their response, in terms of it being aggressive or violence, depends on, number one, what cognitive scripts do they have? What cognitive biases do they have that influence how they perceive what's going on in the environment? And the second aspect of this model is expectations, knowledge, and the degree to which a person believes they should respond, the likelihood of various outcomes. These cognitive processes, again, happen very quickly. it's autopilot thinking, and it's definitely based on what we talked about previously, your early childhood experiences that are going to influence how you interpret information and the expectations you have for outcomes. If you interpret things very much on a bias and your expectation is that becoming physically aggressive gets you the outcome that you want, that's going to probably cause you to be aggressive and violent in your reaction. The next step is knowledge and belief about how people usually respond in certain situations and the degree to which a person believes he or she has the ability to respond effectively. By the way, these are called integrated theories. Integrated theories are theories that look at different aspects of human development and response. So when we talked about your biology, your psychology, your social processes, your cognitive processes, all of these are taken into consideration with these models, and they're taking into consideration your early childhood experiences, your thinking processes, if you have any of those biases that we talked about, social learning theory. All of those things are taken into consideration with these models. I cubed is another integrated theory. These are these are theories that really are a little bit more complex. Because they're a little bit more complex, they're sometimes not very popular. But this one was an expansion on general aggression model, and it tries to incorporate many elements of the many theories out there on aggression. It recognizes the role of biology, your social world, your personality, your cognitive processes, just like with general aggression model, but also looks at the process by which a risk factor promotes aggression and how multiple risk factors interrelate to either increase or reduce aggression. So it organizes risk factors into three categories. One, initiating triggers. These are incidents that arouse aggression. Two, impelling forces. These are forces that increase the likelihood of aggression following those triggers. And three, inhibition forces, sorry about that, factors that reduce the likelihood of an aggressive response. So an example might be somebody shoves you. So that is the instigating trigger. Number two, you've been drinking. Sometimes people who are drinking tend to be a little bit more aggressive, or their thinking is impelled, impeded, and their inhibitions are down with drinking as well. So you've been drinking. That's kind of an impelling force that could kind of increase the likelihood that you're going to become aggressive. But a friend or the presence of a police officer is there. And so that actually decreases your reaction. So we have these triggers. We have either impelling forces in our environment that are going to increase the likelihood that we're going to react with aggression or violence, or we have factors in our environment that are going to decrease whether or not we are going to react with violence or aggression. All right, that brings us to overt and covert act of aggressions. So there's two types of aggressions, and they differ in terms of, number one, their behavioral patterns, number two, the emotions associated, three, cognitions, the way that you're thinking, and four, development. So with overt aggression, the behavior pattern is direct. It's direct, overt aggression, or could also be violence. So direct confrontation with victims generally decreases with age. The emotions that are involved with overt aggression is anger, high levels of arousal and violence. The thinking, you lack social cognition for coming up with non-aggressive solutions. Remember, we were talking about those thinking bias, and sometimes people don't have the skills necessary. They never learned the skills for dealing with conflict. And the development is aggression begins early, especially in boys. It's going to be people that have those cognitive biases, and really it's because of early childhood abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, peer rejection, things like that. Covert is concealed dishonesty, sneaky behavior, and this is something that actually tends to increase with age. The emotion is less emotion, crimes such as fraud, larceny, and theft. There's not a lot of high arousal involved with covert, especially when we're talking about criminal behavior. Cognitively relies on cognitive capabilities such as being able to plan, deceitfulness, and the development can evolve as well-learned strategy to escape punishment. So behaviorally speaking, overt aggression is usually involves direct confrontation, either threats of physical harm or actual physical harm, where covert does not typically involve direct confrontation or physical harm. And it's more like passive aggressive aggression, especially in terms if you're looking at criminal behavior. Reactive aggression. Reactive aggression is when we react to something or somebody else in our environment. So somebody says something to us and we become angry. We throw temper tantrums. We might become vengeful and want to get revenge on somebody. Proactive aggression is there's not somebody or something in your environment triggering you. So with reactive aggression, we have a trigger. There's no trigger with proactive aggression. And this is kind of the scariest type of aggression: bullying, domination, coercive acts, violence towards other people, abuse. These would all be examples of proactive aggression where there's typically nothing in the environment that triggers that. It's just somebody that tends to be violent, tends to be more prone to aggressive reaction. Gender differences in aggression. I've kind of already mentioned that males tend to be more aggressive than females, especially when we talk about physical aggression. And most of that is actually just due to our biology. So because men have more testosterone, and testosterone is linked to higher levels of aggression, men just biologically tend to be more aggressive than women. And in addition to the biology behind it, we also have different ways that we socialize males and females, particularly in our culture, but in all cultures, it's a little, they socialize men and women differently. Little boys from a very young age here in the United States are socialized to be physically aggressive. They're encouraged to play physically aggressive sports. They are encouraged to fight back. Girls, on the other hand, are socialized. And again, our biology is different. So women tend to be just a little bit less aggressive anyway, physically aggressive. And girls are socialized in our culture to be sweet and kind and not engage in physically aggressive behaviors. The gender differences that we see emerge in preschool, and that really, kind of points to the role that biology plays, but it also points to the role that the way that we socialize people begins. But when they've done studies where they've looked at little boys and little girls, like preschool, 3, 4-ish, and they've done where they had a table filled with lots of different toys, and some of them were kind of gender male and some were gender female, and some were more kind of gender aggressive or physically aggressive, and some were like more relational play. And little boys and little girls just tended to gravitate naturally to kind of gender appropriate, in terms of how we would define that in our culture, toys. Girls tended to gravitate towards the toys that were kind of play house, be kind to each other. And boys tended to gravitate towards the more physically or aggressive toys like footballs and Tonka trucks and kind of masculine things. So we also find that boys tend to, starting in preschool and definitely by the early, grade school years, tend to engage in physically aggressive play. So it's called rough and tumble play in developmental psychology, but they like to wrestle. They like to push each other around. They like to play, aggressive sports. And girls tend to like to play relational play, like playing house, playing doctor, brushing each other's hair, playing with dolls, things like that. I know that sounds very sexist, but that's what they found when they have done studies. And it really does just kind of support the idea that men and women are just biologically different, and we socialize males and females differently in this country from a very early age. The effects of media violence. Remember, I talked about social learning theory, and I mentioned in a previous chapter that social learning theory has done studies on the effects of media on behavior. So, are people learning violent or aggressive responses from violent video games, from violent television shows, violent movies, things like that? And they have been doing research on this for many, many years. Um, some of the interesting research that has come out, over half of adolescents have played violent video games. On average, an American child will see over 100,000 violent acts and 20,000 murders in the media by the time they are teenagers. Now, that's a lot of violence that we see in our culture. The research, however, is mixed. They seem to agree that there are some people that are high risk and sensitive to content, but they typically have other issues going on. For the vast majority of us, if we think about ourselves, for example, how many of us like to play what would be considered violent video games? How many of us like violent television shows? How many of us like scary horror movies or violent movies? And think of yourself and how often do you feel the need after playing a violent video game or watching a television show? Do you feel the need to go beat up your neighbor or go rob a liquor store? For most of us, it's never. So the thing to keep in mind when you see research on the effects of media, it could be one factor among many. So there are definitely people who are sensitive to content, but they usually have other issues going on, other mental health issues. And so this tends to be a trigger for them. It's one factor among many, but media does not cause. There's no cause and effect with violent media in terms of causing people to go out and commit crimes. I will say that young people are more sensitive to this content. Children are definitely sensitive to content. They don't have the cognitive chops to kind of understand the difference between fantasy and reality. And that's where parents really need to step in and make sure that their children are watching appropriate content and playing the appropriate video games. So children definitely at risk. The other thing to keep in mind is that young people today are desensitized a little bit to violence because young people today have seen so many acts, as I kind of mentioned earlier. My son, I'll just tell you a personal story. My son and I, when he was about, maybe 17 or 18, we were driving down the road and he was telling me about a video he'd seen on YouTube of somebody on a skateboard, like falling in off a rail or whatever and breaking his leg. And the way he was describing, and it was a real video, and the way he was describing it was very disturbing, this broken bone sticking out, and he didn't even seem fazed by it. And if I was watching something like that, I probably couldn't watch the whole thing and it would make me very uncomfortable. And I asked him, wow, doesn't it bother you to watch stuff like that? And he said, no, I've my friends and I have been watching, videos like that since we were young. So he has seen so much violence with access to the internet, on TV, much more than I did when I was 17. We did not have the level of violence and the access to what young people today can see. He's definitely desensitized to it. So it's definitely something to think about in terms of, moving forward, doing research on does this kind of desensitization because of the amount of violence that we have access to in our culture, is that going to affect people moving forward in terms of becoming more aggressive or more violent towards other people? So most of the research that has been done on the effects of violence in media shows that there are short-term effects, especially with childhood. The vast majority of people do not have long-term effects, but there are some people, again, who are sensitive to content because they have other issues going on that might have long-term effects for that. So again, when you hear, media talking about the effects of violent content, keep in mind that for the vast majority of us, it is not going to cause us to engage in violence or to be aggressive towards other people. For those who are sensitive to the content or who have other issues going on, it may be one risk factor among many. Now, there is something called the copycat effect. It's the idea that people might copy or imitate activity that they see in the media. We've seen that with copycat school shooters, copycat terrorists. I mean, there are definitely people that are learning things by modeling, especially learning things on the internet. So the copycat effect does exist, and it is something that, of course, we need to worry about when it comes to violence in the media. All right, if you have any questions about anything in this chapter, let me know. There are several great articles under under Chapter 5 in D2L about some of the things that we talked about, including violent video games and aggression, hormone and aggression, which we talked about with testosterone in men. There's an article on the general aggression model and frustration aggression theory. If you have any other questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.